And yeah, that's true too, Rick. You can use the audio noise suppression settings as you need to try and muffle background noise. You know.
Speaking of which, how's mine? Do you hear a lot of background out of mine?
No, you're good.
Yeah, I forgot my regular headphones and my other earbuds here.
That's okay. You're a little muffled, but it's all right.
Trying to jump around the office, so like a little bit of a quiet corner.
There you go.
Is in short supply.
In Jayville, I'm shocked.
Right? We still got to get you guys out here sometime on that.
Yeah, well, it's not like I can just, pick up and drive 20 minutes and I'm there, so.
Well,
The Super 8 is really nice.
Living right upstairs. Yeah, the Super 8 is nice this time of year.
There's a nice corn patch right next to it, so you really get the feel of being out there if you go at the right time of year.
Oh.
Yeah, well, they done cut the corn, so it's all down.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, Lauren. How you doing?
Hello, I'm doing just fine, thanks. I hope you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just pull up my lines here, and we can actually kick this thing off proper-like. Welcome back to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Before we dive into topic, we should probably go around and introduce ourselves. Just say hello quickly. This one's going to be a little bit interesting because, we do have a number of voices on the recording today who have been on before, but we also have a special guest with us. We're joined today by Lauren Blocker. Now, let me see if I have your title in front of me. I don't, but you're joining us from, Rockwell Automation, who owns Verve, and so, you thus owns the podcast. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Ken. Happy to speak with y'all today. My name is Lauren Blocker. I'm an industrial cybersecurity consulting partner at Rockwell. My role is focused on helping our enterprise customers articulate their cyber maturity current state, build out an enterprise-wide, globally consistent, standards-based roadmap to help drive maturity, and then to execute against those plans, drawing on all of the expertise that we as Rockwell can bring to bear.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. And I gather you've been doing this for quite a while now.
So I've been with Rockwell a little over 5 years, almost 6. But prior to that, I worked in enterprise IT sales, helping organizations leverage the various different value propositions, managed services, managed networks, to help drive value and business value from their technology initiatives. So I've been involved in technology really my whole career.
Awesome. So just going across my screen here, Drew Wintermeier's back. Hello, Drew.
Hello, Ken. Yeah, I'm Andrew Wintermeier from Verve's OT Research Lab.
Awesome. And Zach, you're back as well.
I am. Hey, Ken, sorry, I had to work the mic a little bit. I'm Zachary Walter from Customer Successes team.
Awesome. And we also have Tyler Bergman with us.
Hey, guys. Tyler Bergman, Operations Manager over here at Verve.
And finding a quiet corner in the Jerseyville office to not inject too much background noise into the discussion from. And Lance, you're back too.
Yes, sir. Lance Lamont, happy to be back. Looking forward to another great conversation.
Nice. And I actually do have one other introduction to make this time. Rick Herzing is joining us for the first time. Hello, Rick.
Hello, all. Hello, Lauren. Pleasure to meet you.
Likewise.
Ken is my supervisor. I work for Verve Lifecycle Services Support.
That you do. All righty. So the topic for today was suggested by Lauren herself. And this one sounds like it's going to be a fairly dense conversation. So the idea, Lauren, that you pitched when we went around looking for, possible podcast ideas was the OT and ICS cyber maturity journey and why so many organizations are so far behind, but think that they're further ahead than they truly are. So let's maybe start with, let's just talk a little bit about what the cyber maturity journey means, because right away, that seems like a term that we should spend some time unpacking.
I agree with that. So I'm taking some thought leadership from external to Rockwell, external to Verve, and I'm leaning on Gartner. So Gartner is out there collecting lots and lots of thought leadership. They have decades in doing this. And a few years back, they went out from their traditional IT thought leadership space and started talking a little bit more about industrial controls environments and organizations that are responsible for industrial controls environments. We call it OT, operational technology, or industrial controls. Gartner calls it cyber physical systems, or CPS. And they surveyed a number of leaders and practitioners who have responsibility in their purview of securing these cyber physical systems, as we would call OT. And they were able to accumulate a lot of really interesting data. But I have one graphic in particular that resonated with me so much that I've used it in every single customer meeting that I've had in the last 3 years. So envision, if you will, a thermometer that goes from left to right. And it describes the 6 phases of cyber maturity that Gartner outlined in this discussion with these many, many customers. Phase 1, they titled awareness. That's the very beginning step of building out and starting this journey of cyber maturity around cyber physical systems. Phase 1 awareness is about recognizing that there's something that needs to be done and really committing to addressing the need for OT-centric cybersecurity. Once you've achieved awareness in phase 1, you can move into phase 2, which is visibility. Visibility is about gaining visibility into the assets that you have and having a general network map. From phase 2, once you've accomplished that, you can move into those oh wow moments. Now we know there's something we need to do. We know what we have. We're sitting down, the light bulbs are going off, and we're realizing where we have these cybersecurity blind spots, where there are governance gaps, where there are risks that we didn't know existed. On phase 3, clients then move into firefighting mode, right? That's where they're prioritizing and addressing those top blind spots, the risks, the governance gaps. And after they've achieved all that, only then are they moving into integration and optimization. Now, according to why this infographic is so valuable, is that if you were to survey a number of CISOs or other InfoSec leaders of organizations, if you asked them where they thought they were on that cyber maturity journey, those leaders would tell you that they are probably in phase 5 or phase 6. They're either integrating or they're optimizing. When reality is 60% of organizations are still grappling with building awareness, phase 1. A full 90% of organizations have not yet achieved integration or optimization.
I mean, in a way, it doesn't surprise because, and I think many of the, other folks on the call, certainly myself, though, having worked in the field with a lot of clients who've been somewhere along that journey, and maybe not necessarily consciously following the steps as Gartner outlined, but, like you can hear all of those different categories and kind of, mentally think about a particular client and map them to where they are along that journey. And we've definitely, I think most of us have seen or are aware of that very real struggle for a lot of our clients, and especially in an OT setting, to, well, for lack of a better way of putting it, move themselves along. And I mean, certainly what we do at Verve is kind of an important component to that, because you can't really begin to even sort of form a picture of where you are at in that journey if you don't even know what the scope of that journey is, right? If you don't even know what's in your environment, how do you even start down the path towards cyber maturity?
That is spot on, Ken.
The other thing, though, that kind of what I want to ask about is how hard are the boundaries between those different steps? Because it seems to me like a lot of companies probably think they're further ahead because maybe they actually have legitimately started taking steps to integrate and to firefight and to move to those higher maturity states, but they haven't completed all of the work that was necessary to, like, finish off the first phase, right? And then move to the second phase. It seems to me like there's probably a lot of companies who think they're further along than they are because they're working on like 3 or 4 of these categories all at once and never really finishing any of them.
I think that's part of the problem. I think another, aha moment, if you will, is that many times InfoSec leaders, CIOs, they're concentrating on the enterprise IT type assets. They're thinking about laptops and servers and cell phones and, all those ubiquitous necessary types of assets, and making sure that they're patched and that their AV is working the way that it's supposed to, and that they've got the password resets every 30, 60, 90 days, whatever their policies are. But where the disconnect is that they're not thinking about all of the connected assets that are creating data and that are causing data to move around and that are making product or moving packages around or whatever the case might be. They're not thinking about all of those assets that make money for the company every single day. They're not viewing those as necessarily part of their purview. And so therefore, on the enterprise side, they probably do have a great deal of maturity in their cyber journey around that category of assets. It's only when you start to review this other, largely unknown set of connected assets that live in their industrial control systems that you start to realize, okay, these systems weren't built with cybersecurity on the forefront. They may not have been patched recently. They may not have been patched ever. The life cycles of these controllers and other assets are measured in decades, not in the 3 to 5 year type of life cycle window that you see for traditional IT, enterprise IT type assets. And so for a long time, they've just said those are not in our purview. And for a long time, OT leaders have said, that's fine. We don't want you to treat these OT assets the way that you treat the IT assets because it'll break everything. So we come to where we are in, the year of our Lord 2024, and organizations are starting to understand through compliance requirements and federal mandates and other compliance requirements that, oh no, somebody does need to be understanding what the inherent risks and vulnerabilities are in our industrial controls networks for a whole host of reasons. And it's at that point that they start to kind of get their arms around the fact that there's something that still needs to be done, and usually a whole lot of things that need to be done. Another thing that I see organizations doing is really underfunding and under-resourcing these types of programs for industrial controls. It's, a very costly endeavor to do even what we would consider to be a pretty low-level thing. Segment your networks, right? The idea of and the cost associated with truly segmenting a customer's network from, to follow the Purdue model and to provide managed switches everywhere and all of those things that we know to be best practices, to try to perform that at scale across plants that have been in existence for years, decades, who knows how long. It's a hard investment to swallow. So we think at that point, it becomes almost overwhelming. And I know all of you all have probably worked with customers maybe in the early stages of their cyber maturity journey, either through deployment of technology or through doing and performing customer assessments and other professional services types of activities, that sometimes they'll fund a small, awareness activity to help get them some visibility. And then that usually they take that information and move right back into awareness. Okay, now we know we have some problems, and now we know partially what could be done to, mitigate those issues. But now we take that back and we really need to go back to the organization and see if they will resource us with the hundreds of thousands or millions or whatever the number is to truly mitigate these issues at scale. So I think that's also been a little bit of a challenge with most organizations in prioritizing the necessary investments in, the projects, the people, the technologies, the processes to help them kind of mature quicker. We don't have, the 10 or 15 or 20 years to get to phase 5. And so we have to help our client organizations really understand how to be strategic in their approach and how to create a remediation roadmap that aligns to their biggest risks as well as to their financial and investment priorities to help move the program along that makes the most sense in their specific situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I mean, a lot of what you're saying kind of gets back to something that Rick Kahn discussed in an earlier episode that we did on the podcast, where he was talking about how security is really, well, it ought to be a program, not just individual tech and not just individual snapshots of activity. The idea of a program is that it's something that's kind of constantly in motion, something that you're constantly working on. But you're right, that does take more resourcing than just, it's funny to be doing this episode in like November, because in a previous consultancy role that I was in, October, November, a bit of December were like the busy times. And I was always away because that was like, everybody's getting to the end of their year and they're like, oh, we have all this budget left. Well, okay, let's just throw something at let's throw some money at doing another cybersecurity assessment or something like that, right? And so then, then they start calling us in to do just that. And it's like, you've gone the whole year, you haven't really thought anything about your OT security, but now we're coming up to the end of the year and you're like, well, let's see how we're doing. And I get it because, you only have a little bit of budget left. Yeah. And you don't want to, come in under budget and then lose money next year. But at the same time, it's like, okay, well, it's, not that doing an assessment is a bad thing, but this is probably something that should have been distributed. This workload could have been distributed across the whole year. And it's, speaking about like assessments in particular, right? A lot of that just entailed running around and trying to like identify all of these assets. And sometimes you'd come in and you'd be just like, okay, well, do you have an asset list that I can compare findings against? A lot of times they did, sometimes they didn't, which gets back to, that question of visibility and just of sort of the often patchwork nature of OT systems. You built out that unit a couple decades ago, and then you added the next unit like 8 years after that. And then the third and fourth units came online at the same time, but then you upgraded only the third unit, not the fourth unit. And it becomes, so you have this very patchwork environment. You potentially have this very patchwork environment where that coupled with like staff turnover and possibly mergers and acquisitions as, corporations change hands, you end up in this situation where, again, nobody's 100% sure what's even out there anymore. So yeah, it's like.
Yeah, but full spectrum, Ken. I mean, we've got several customers out there that are on, right-hand side where they're contacting us on, schedule to do like, hey, we need somebody to come in and do our NERC SIP audit on our firewall rules, things of that nature.
True.
I mean, it's both ends of the spectrum that we service out there. It's just trying to see where they are at within their journey, right? Typically.
Mm-hmm. It almost seems sometimes though, like, the ones that are like at that high maturity point, I don't know if this is true for you, but certainly for me, like I find that, when you encounter a client who has hit that high level of maturity and everything is just beautifully implemented, and they are bringing you in for some specific high maturity task, they're almost a unicorn, like they're the ones that really like stand out because you don't encounter it too terribly often. It's nice when you do though.
But it's typically those CISOs that have very apparent knowledge in the OT space. Right? So one of the things I was going to throw out there for Lauren is, was there additional context out there around what was the disconnect from the CISO level from the indications that they're like a level 5 or level 6 versus a level 1 in the OT landscape?
Yeah, that's a great point, Tyler. And you're right. 90% are real immature, 10% are far more mature. Those 10% of organizations tend to be as mature as they are, usually because of some sort of very stringent compliance requirements that have been applied to them for many, many years. You talked about NERC-CIP. That's a perfect example. Other organizations that are involved in power generation or distribution, 20 something years ago had some very stringent federal requirements placed on them by Homeland Security. And so they've been at this game a pretty long time. And therefore, they've made the investments. They've hired the people with the right skill sets. They've resourced the technologies. They've, come into their strategies, their plannings, their programmatic approach with an understanding that they have to have their industrial control systems in alignment with these, stringent federal guidelines and compliance requirements in order to operate their business.
Right.
Not so for your kind of run-of-the-mill, we make, consumer products or, other also equally important types of, businesses. But if you have less compliance requirements on you or historically have had less stringent compliance requirements around cybersecurity, then you're going to have invested less in it. It won't have been the critical requirement to operate your business as it would be if you were in one of those highly regulated environments.
Right. So the other thing that we're seeing out there too is some of the insurance requirements. So a lot of folks wrote it off as, oh, I'll just go out there and get cyber insurance. Well, as the cyber insurance carriers started doing their underwriting and started getting hits as far as claims and things like that, then they're like, yeah, we need to make sure that you're doing a little bit more of your due diligence out there before we'll underwrite you guys for insurance. So that's kind of what we've been typically running into lately. Some of the other industries that are not highly regulated out there.
Yeah, is that they'll perform some level of assessment, due diligence, and whatnot in order to be underwritten by a cyber insurance provider. That's the driver that you're seeing a lot with the activities that you're running, Tyler.
One thing that I've also hit on more than once, and I see this mainly in the water industry, is and you would think it still baffles me that water isn't considered critical infrastructure, but it hasn't yet been classified as such. And but the other thing that I notice with the handful of clients I've dealt with who've been on water industry clients, whether that's water treatment for drinking water or wastewater treatment further down the chain, the margins are incredibly thin. It's all well and good to talk about resourcing and budget, but then you talk to people working in the water industry and they're just like, budget? What does that word even mean?
Yeah, that's right. You're thinking about municipalities, and there are some large municipalities. I'm sure y'all can think of, some of the large cities in the United States, but there are many, many, many very small, very underfunded municipalities that are out there, just trying to keep the water flowing. And the idea that there are, highly funded, very sophisticated cyber adversaries to try to defend against that is, with such limited resourcing, it's daunting, right?
Sounds like a recent cyber attack out there. There's one of the underfunded municipalities that was out there that got hit, right?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, one of the more sort of what were they thinking stories from the pandemic and when everybody got forced into work at home, right, came out of the water industry as well. And it was, what was the tech they were using? I don't want to say, it wasn't GoToMeeting, but it was, whatever, some sort of remote desktop technology, not RDP, but, in that. Anywhere or something. Yeah, PC Anywhere. That's the one, I think. And it was, it was an actual operations workstation that was sitting out there on PC Anywhere. And, it was probably just something that they had slapped into place because it was quick and easy and not too costly. And they needed to send all their operators home, but they also still needed to keep, monitoring and producing water. And it was, a case of where any internet rando could hit this same PC Anywhere endpoint. And someone did and started tweaking the
lie levels.
The lie levels. in the water treatment process. And I mean, thankfully, there were safeguards further along, sensors to monitor content in the water that caught that, flagged it, and it was addressed. But, it ultimately, it was essentially just leaving the control system sitting out there on the internet for anybody to play with. But it's not like they would have even probably had the budget or maybe even somebody with the know-how to set up a more robust system to allow their operators to log in after the mandate came down saying nobody goes to the office.
Starting tomorrow.
Yeah, right? Yeah, with one day of warning.
Yeah. I mean, here's another great example of, for folks who work in offices and carpeted spaces, we all could fairly easily transition to a work from home scenario when that happened, but not the same investments were made to keep water being made or plants operating the way that they needed to necessarily because it was overlooked. It wasn't necessarily in the purview of the CIO, and OT is handling it, but unprecedented times, right? It's hard to be prepared for something that's never happened before.
Absolutely. Coming back to Tyler's point a little bit, I mean, I do think, and Tyler's point about like CISOs kind of driving the maturity, CISOs with, deep OT knowledge sort of really driving maturity in the OT space and in their companies, which, I mean, kind of gets back to your point too, Lauren, which is resourcing. And because if the CISO has that sort of depth of OT knowledge and, especially if it helps if there is an insurance consideration or regulatory consideration as well. But, having the knowledgeable CISO driving things from the top generally means that those programs further down the line, if there is budget available, it's going to be made available to them. They are actually going to have that support versus how it often works in the opposite direction, where you have a ground level operations team, maybe, and I say team kind of in the very loose sense, it might just be one or two people at a plant. But you have a ground level team that is supposed to be handling OT security for a particular site or a particular facility, and they're just trying to, beg and scrape together what budget they can. And there's maybe not necessarily a lot of support higher up because essentially all of those security efforts are just seen as a cost center. And to be fair, they are a cost center, but it's much, I mean, insurance of any kind is always a cost center. You're not, you typically don't make money off of insurance unless you are an insurance company. But if you're paying for insurance, the idea is that whatever it's costing you, if something even more costly comes along, even more costly and disastrous comes along, then it's at least backstopping your losses. And it sometimes seems to be quite difficult to get companies to like reframe their thinking there, to move away from just seeing a security program is just costing us money to, okay, well, this security program costs this much, but potentially offsets this much larger amount of costs due to plant downtime, due to ransomware, or whatever the concerns are. But then the trick is, how do those, if the CISO already is on board with that thinking, it's going to be a much easier time and you're going to be able to move towards that greater maturity, like Tyler says. But if you're the ground level team, the site level team, trying to sell that idea upwards through management and ultimately up to, the VP or the C-suite, whoever's in control of releasing the budget that you need, that is a much harder road.
Yeah, I want to go back to a comment you made a little while ago, Ken, about the notion of a cybersecurity program, and then contrast that with the idea of like a cybersecurity insurance premium. And I think a lot of folks tend to conflate the outcomes of both of those two things. We don't need a cyber program because we have cyber insurance, so we're fine, no thank you. Or somebody in our cyber insurance provider wants us to do, these 6 things, so they'll underwrite us again next year. And that's what's driving the investments, probably very limited, that we want to make in cybersecurity, projects, if you will. I think the best job we can do to help our customers gain maturity is to have a bright line right in between the ideas and the investments around a cybersecurity program and the value that it brings compared to the cost of a cyber insurance premium. I think along those lines, we oftentimes have folks say, help me get compliant. I've got some new federal mandates, or my industry is subject to this, or, we're in Europe and we have these new mandates coming down as part of NIS2. We really want to help folks consider, do you want to be compliant or do you want to be secure? Because just achieving the kind of checklist that your cyber underwriter says that you have to do for them to underwrite them is not going to make you secure. It's going to make you a tolerable risk for them to provide some sort of coverage. Likewise, just checking the boxes in, some sort of a compliance requirement may not get you to the level of cybersecurity or risk that your executive team and investors wants to tolerate. If you focus on achieving cybersecurity best practices, you will be compliant. You will meet the requirements of your cyber underwriter. You will overachieve those things, and you will provide better value to your executives, your board, your investors as a publicly traded organization.
Tyler, you had a thought there in the background.
I know. It's just I just got this comment out there. It's like, Lauren, I am just overwhelmed on just how politely you framed that, because so it's like, you're either checking the box or you're being more adamant about your security, right? I love that. No, that's great.
Very frank framing. I like that. But, this provides us maybe a good segue here as we kind of come into the back half of the recording. And by the way, Lauren, I'll have to get you to send me that Gartner graphic. And if I can figure out how to incorporate it into the show notes or make it like the episode art, I will. But yeah, I guess the question, if we can possibly address that in, like, say, the next 15, 20 minutes, what can we do to help clients move along that maturity journey? Because it's all well and good to, spotlight some of the issues that we see in those journeys, but what can we do coming in to help move them along and actually get them from a level 1 or a level 2 to up into like the level 4 and beyond range?
I could talk for an entire hour about this, maybe longer. I'm a lot of fun at parties, let me tell you. I'm very passionate about this topic. And I've had a lot of conversations about it along the way.
Well, if we can do it the Coles Notes version today, we might have to have you back on for an expanded edition.
Perfect.
Well, I'm just looking at this graphic out here, and I'm just thinking, it's like, tell me more about this oh wow phase.
Yeah. So I think step 1, let's make sure we have all of the right stakeholders all talking the same language within a client organization. We're not just talking to OT and OT alone. We are absolutely having IT, InfoSec leaders and practitioners in the room to help articulate the current state and the future state we want to get to. If we can have executive oversight helping to shape, what is the risk profile that this company feels like where they want to be, all the better. From there, once we've gained that common viewpoint of where we are and where we want to be, it's infinitely easier to get somewhere if everybody knows where they want to go. You want to align to a standard, right? We talk a lot about NIST cybersecurity framework here in North America. It is the gold standard. It's not the only standard, but it's probably the easiest one to articulate and for folks with all different skill sets and responsibilities to be able to get behind. It's based on kind of those 5 pillars that really align to the cyber maturity journey that I talked about that Gartner articulates for us. And it also talks about identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. So from there, we can gain alignment with the key stakeholders, with our client organizations, and get a metric around how good of a job are you doing in each one of those 5 categories. And there's a whole host of different ways that Rockwell can help our customers to start to understand that. But it's a journey, right? It's not a one size fits all. It's not, it's taken decades for organizations to get to the state where they are today. It's, there's no magic eraser or easy button that we can fix everybody's problem areas, but kind of getting a viewpoint on it and getting common understanding amongst folks who work in it every day, right? Our OT practitioners and leaders, as well as our InfoSec practitioners and leaders, and then our executives to help prioritize the investments that'll be necessary over the long haul to really build out that maturity. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do is help customers get that high-level roadmap. And again, there's a number of different ways that we can help them get there. It's almost always going to be a combination of applying our Rockwell and Verve's people, processes, and technologies to the customer environment to be able to get our arms around the visibility, right? The moving into the oh wow, and then into the firefighting in a strategic way. But there's then so much more that we can do to help build out that 3-year roadmap that's going to include things that IT is going to do, that InfoSec is going to do, that OT is going to do, and that we're all going to do together. One of the things that's resonated for me a lot with clients who are really just kind of starting this journey and want the easy button, if you will, or want to know what are the kind of low-hanging fruit things that they should start to think about investing in, problems that they should try to solve first. Obviously looking at that Gartner roadmap is a good place to kind of just get some concepts. But if we want to get a little bit more granular, I like to call it table stakes. What does it take to start a more OT-centric cybersecurity strategy? So the table stakes for OT cyber strategy are, number 1, let's develop an ICS-focused incident response plan. If you don't have one of those already, I all but guarantee that the one that the IT folks have in their binder in the CISO's office is probably not going to be applicable to what happens in the OT environment. So that gives you the opportunity to start engaging and giving you a red phone on the desk if something really bad happens in your most important facility. The next items that I think need to be approached are accurate asset identification, timely assets to the known vulnerabilities that exist on those assets, and the ability to prioritize and contextualize the vulnerabilities that exist in your environment so that you can be smart about remediating in a way that makes the most sense and moves the needle the most with the most limited amount of investment. The 5th item in table stakes is really about a minimum defensible architecture. Do you have some level of segmentation within your environment that would keep the worst from becoming as bad as it could possibly be? Do you have segmentation between your IT networks and your OT networks? That's a great place to start creating some segmentation. From there, developing more in-depth segmentation to prevent, something bad from happening, from spreading like wildfire across your environment would be another great place to start. So that's table stakes.
It's interesting to hear you list all that out because, some of that is definitely what we do, just kind of as, day-to-day Verve stuff, Right. A huge part of our offering is asset discovery. And you can't really defend what you have if you don't know what you have to defend. It's interesting too, though, you mentioned identifying those critical paths or those critical points that if nothing else, this is what needs to be defended, which Zach and I talked about a couple of episodes ago as well with, the discussion about calculated risk rankings and figuring out like, what are I use the term crown jewels. What are the crown jewels in your environment? Like you lose these things and you are shut down 15 minutes flat versus things where, yeah, you don't want to lose them, but if you do, you're going to be able to keep going. And being able to do all of those, and I mean, you can only do those analyses once you have good visibility, once you have a good sense of what your asset inventory actually is. Once you actually know what you have, then you can actually look at that and say, okay, these things right here, this is like the core. We need to protect these more than anything else. And that can then turn over into, the discussion. Now you can start to have the discussions about like, okay, what do we need to defend those things? And that at least lets you now inform, the budget ask that's inevitably going to have to come out of that.
I think there's a very important aspect that we're missing here. And I've seen this shining moment happen several times now already. And where it really comes into play is these CISOs out there. They have this, I'll call it a little bit of a false indication of where they reside within the ecosystem because they're looking at the IT only structure, right? So they're only gaining this knowledge of the OT space because of, stuff they're seeing cropping up in the news and everything like that and all the advocacy around securing their OT side of their systems, right? So it comes down to bridging that gap between IT and OT and having those conversations. That's where we help step in and bridge that divide with the CISO and having those discussions with the OT group as a large. One of the most successful customers that I've had, got everybody all in the same room. It was the CISO, it was some of the IT staff, some of the networking staff, but it was largely all the major directors of the different ecosystems within their plants as a whole. And the question was asked, it's like, what keeps you up at night of what could take down production that we need to be a little bit more formalized on to make sure that things like that doesn't happen? Simple things like backups, all of that nature, all the way throughout the ecosystems. So it's largely building some of that awareness, right, with the players that are in the trenches as far as what keeps them up at night, what matters to the OT folks.
That's that oh wow moment.
Right. That's the big eye opener right there, is trying to build that cohesion between the two different coins within the organization. You got IT and you got OT. IT has been largely on the server infrastructure, all that good stuff. And they think everything's all OT until we go over to the OT side. It's like, wow, you guys been doing this for a while. So it's bridging that gap. And I think for me, that's probably the first and foremost thing a lot of these CISOs should be doing is having those conversations and, start to be realistic about trying to get a little bit decent approach and be a helpful aspect for these guys to help these guys, sleep better at night, right? Because maybe they don't have backups on some of these critical systems, right? I've seen that countless of times, and that's pretty easy win out there. But you're also talking about supporting legacy systems and things of that nature. So it's all about trying to build some type of componentry around that to be able to build against that, or even build a plan to get out of some of that legacy components to where you're not so chaliced with a single XP box in the corner that's running your entire organization, right?
You want to get away from eBay as a backup plan.
That's a fact. I've observed that too. And sometimes I hate to say it, it takes, an executive mandate or a reorg or possibly even, this officially wasn't in your purview last year, but next year it is, or even some of the SEC type of guidelines that have come out in the last couple of years that really give those CISOs a lot more skin in the game around securing their industrial controls environments. So it's
or worse yet, an incident.
Yeah, they end up getting fired if there's an incident. So
absolutely,
that's the end of that person, and then somebody new comes in and takes on the role, and perhaps there's an opportunity to do things differently than before, in my experience. So.
Well, 10, 15 years ago, this wasn't even on their radar.
That's right.
The only time you saw IT on the plant floor was to say, open a port. And then they were almost chased off the floor because everyone was worried they would shut something down. I think it's imperative to impress upon the leadership that OT security is as important, if not more important, than IT security, because it does affect production.
Well, and I mean,
I'm coming at this more from an automation side, of course, but I mean, a major auto manufacturer, they were using PLCs that had laptop hard drives on them. One crashed and the line stopped for nearly 2 weeks, and it was hundreds of thousands of dollars per day.
Yeah.
It was in the paint booth, and the line wasn't moving.
I think too, kind of tagging on to that, there needs to be as much as there needs to be a sort of an enhanced amount of cooperation and communication between the IT and the OT spaces. I can't help but think there also needs to be sort of, in a different use of the word integration, you need to be very cautious about like just how integrated those systems can be. And I mean, it's almost, it's almost a little too on the nose to cite something like a Colonial pipeline, right? But Colonial, that cyber attack didn't hit their OT systems directly. It only took out the business end systems. But because of the specific way that those systems interplayed with each other for things like, production tracking, billing, and all of that, they wound up having to shut the pipeline down because there was just no other option there. So, there needs to be like an enhanced level of cooperation from the IT side and the CISO side down to the OT side and vice versa, without necessarily pairing the systems up too much so that, if if the internet facing part goes down, we don't want to necessarily have to take the hopefully not internet facing part offline as well. But that has been the case in the past.
In the spirit of cooperation, right? I think everybody needs to, and Rick, you talked about, IT folks getting, shown the door for fear that they would cause some unintentional harm to their systems. I think, we have an opportunity to do some, I like to call it family therapy a little bit, to bring those folks together that have, feelings about the other teams. But at the end of the day, cybersecurity is for everybody. And it takes all these skill sets and all this expertise to come up with a programmatic approach that achieves protection of the business, because everybody will be impacted if, for example, cars can't get painted and get out the door. That impacts everybody.
Absolutely. Well, I have all of 5 minutes left, so I think maybe, how about one quick little roundtable session here? I'll just invite anybody I'll go around. I'll call names, and then we will wrap it up. But Drew, you've been quiet, so if you have any parting thoughts to fire out, now's a good time.
I always enjoy being on the call. Just honored to be here sometimes. I think I talk enough most of the time. I was happy to sit back and just hear the fascinating conversation. Thanks for having me.
All right. Brilliant. How about you, Zach?
I'm right there with Drew. It's just a pleasure to be here. I love listening in on it. I think, a lot of your guys' key points, I think it really hits home because, IT is great, but OT, it really secures jobs. It makes jobs. It really, kind of pushes the envelope forward. You got to think about how many people are employed within the OT environment. So securing that and keeping that safe, I think, is absolutely paramount.
Cool. And I can't help but agree. Lance.
Yeah. Earlier on, we were talking about the different stages, starting at the awareness and visibility. I kept visualizing it as a car race. But instead of cars, it's every single connected communicating device in your entire facility. So the first question is, do we even know how many things are out there in the race? That's starting to build that visibility. But then where do we track it? How do we know when we've won the race? And, oh, by the way, the finish line moves every year. How do we know when we run the race? How do we do this? How do we keep everything moving forward? And it was an interesting visual that I was sort of playing with. And then as we were talking about this, I realized maybe we're not heading towards something. We're trying to avoid having a industry altering event, having an incident where we lost data, where we had a line down. So maybe we're running away from something, but I think the race, analogy still works reasonably well. So that was my thoughts as we were talking. But thank you very much for having me involved.
Absolutely. Rick?
Just to expand a bit on what Drew and Zach said, and I mentioned it once, but I'll mention it again. A good way to get their attention is to mention the expense of not doing this. I mean, it gets expensive quickly depending on the production site. It really does. And it's a good place to start to get their attention. I'm talking phase one in the graphic here, of course, and I realize here I'm preaching to the choir, but it's an important point.
Righty-o.
And thank you for having me.
Always, always. And Tyler?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, my biggest point is, that CISOs just need to keep an open mind and get out and have those conversations with the folks that make the widgets and what keeps them up at night, or what has the potential to bring production down. I think is the biggest key point out there. And if you get to the point where you feel like you're out of your element, hey, we're around to help you out, Shameless plug there.
All right. And Lauren, final parting thought to yourself.
Yeah, Ken, I want to thank you for allowing me to join this illustrious group today and share some of my thoughts on OT cybersecurity. It's been fun.
Absolutely. And we will have to have you back, I think, to expand a little bit more on some of your thoughts on how we can move people along the maturity journey. But that's it for this month. You have been listening to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Please share our episodes with your friends, family, colleagues, and anyone else you think would be interested in industrial cybersecurity. And please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or wherever you get your podcasts if there's a rating system. This podcast has been produced by me, Kenneth Kully. Our opening and closing music is by the ever so talented Octo Sound. Look him up if you need some music for a podcast or a video. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Zachary. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Lance. And especially thank you, Lauren, for taking part in the discussion today. Thank you out there for listening. We will talk to you soon.